Hello and how's it going? Welcome to the channel, and I am here for a list video for you guys. Now, for this list video, I'll be going over 11 albums that I think are overhated, and these are of course by great bands. Now keep in mind with this list, I'm only going to be going over one album each band, so you're not going to have more than one album by the same band on the list. So with that being said, there's definitely more albums that I think could have made this list, but I just wanted to stick with 11 albums, just these albums, and I felt like, I just went with these albums because I have good reason to, of course. And this is not in any particular order, so let's go ahead and get started. First up, we got All Hope Is Gone by Slipknot. Now, I have seen a lot of people say that this is Slipknot's weakest album. I personally don't agree with that, actually. I think their weakest album is .5 The Gray Chapter. Now, even though that is the case, I still think that album is pretty good, but it just doesn't stand up compared to all the other stuff that they've done, in my opinion. But yeah, I have seen a lot of hate for this album, All Hope Is Gone. A common complaint I've seen is, how Corey Taylor has taken his Stone Sour influence really seriously in this album. It barely sounds like Slipknot. I mean, it is more on the commercial side, which I can understand, how people can be frustrated about that. But I think for what the album is, it's still pretty good. There's definitely a lot to like about it. Of course, you got songs like Sulfur, Psychosocial, and Dead Memories. Now, Dead Memories, sure, it's a little mainstream, but I kind of like it. I don't love it, but I like it. But yeah, you do get some good songs on this album. I would agree it's not their best album, but I don't think it's their worst either. But yeah, I don't understand the hate for this album, man. But yeah, All Hope Is Gone by Slipknot. It had to make the list. Next up, we got A Sense of Purpose by In Flames. Now, I have seen a lot of crap for this album too. I mean, I've seen a lot of people say that this is In Flames' worst album, and I mean, I just don't get it all. Sure, it's not their best album, but really to have this at the bottom, even below Siren Charms, Battles, and even I the Mask, I mean, this album destroys those albums in every way. I mean, like I said, A Sense of Purpose is not their best, but it's a good album. I mean, it's not terrible. I mean, there's definitely a lot to like about it. Of course, you got great songs like The Mirror's Truth, Sleepless Again, Alias, or Elias, however it's said. I've seen several pronunciations for that song, but I don't know. I really like that song too, and it was actually my first In Flames song. And I also really like Delight in Angers too. But yeah, there's some good stuff on this album. It's not perfect, but I think it's good. And like I said, I don't think that this is the best album that In Flames has ever put out. Obviously, this album comes nowhere near their 90s material. I still think this is a good album for what it is. But yeah, A Sense of Purpose by In Flames, I think it's a little too much hate. More than I think it deserves, I think. Because there's some good stuff to be found on this album. So it had to make the list. Alright, so next up we got Spiritual Healing by Death. Now, of course, I've seen some people say, well, actually, I've seen most people that are fans of Death say that, this is their weakest album. This is the worst album that Death has ever put out. And believe it or not, I don't think it's their worst album. Their weakest album is, in my opinion, probably The Sound of Perseverance. Now, I know that's a very, very unpopular opinion, because I know there's people that say that that's one of their best, but to me, it just doesn't have the same replay value as the other stuff in Death's discography. But Spiritual Healing, though, it's a great album, and if you're one of those people that do say that this is their worst album, please give it another chance. It's a great album, and really go into it and enjoy it for what it is. There's definitely a lot of great songs on this album, such as Living Monstrosity, Altering the Future, and of course the title track. But yeah, definitely a great album. I don't think it's Death's best album, but to say that it's their worst, it's a little pushing it, I think. I think this is a great album, actually. So Spiritual Healing by Death, such a great album, and I'll never understand the hate for this album. But yeah, really good stuff here. Next up, we got Silence in the Snow by Trivium. Now, I will admit, this album is probably somewhere towards the bottom for me in Trivium's discography. But I don't know if I'd put it like at the very bottom anymore. I'm not sure about that. But even though that's the case, I still think this is a good album. I don't think it's a great album, but I think it's a good album. But yeah, of course, you got really good songs on here like the title track, Blind Leading the Blind, Until the World Goes Cold, and Rise Above the Tides, which is maybe my favorite song on the album. But yeah, Silence in the Snow by Trivium. Not one of Trivium's best, of course, but it's a good album, I think. And I've seen some people give this album a lot of crap, and sure, it's not one of their best, but I don't really see why some people crap on the album as much as they do. It's a fairly good album. I mean, I don't mind it. So, Trivium with their album, Silence in the Snow, it's a really good album, I think, and awfully overhated. Next up, we got Outlive by Demon Hunter. Now, once again, I will admit this is definitely towards the bottom, when it comes to my Demon Hunter ranking and stuff like that. Like, I don't think this is one of their best by any means. This is, closer to the bottom for me. It's not my least favorite Demon Hunter album. My least favorite is still probably The World is a Thorn, but probably after that would come this album. But even though that's the case, I still think this album is fairly good, and I've seen a lot of crap for this album. There's a lot of Demon Hunter fans that do say that this is, just a terrible album. It's not an enjoyable album at all. I'm not sure if I would go that far, because there's actually still some good stuff on this album. Of course, you got songs like Cold Winter Sun, Died in My Sleep, and Slight the Odds. I mean, these are some really great songs. I mean, songs that, I think are really catchy as well. But yeah, I think this album does have actually some of the catchiest songs that Demon Hunter has ever written. But yeah, kind of a unique album in their discography as well. Like I said with Silence in the Snow, Outlive is not one of their best, but I still think it's a good album for what it is. There's definitely some gems to be found on this album. So if you are someone that does say that this is Demon Hunter's worst album, please give it another chance. I mean, I don't expect someone to like the entire thing, but because I do think, while I think there's some good stuff on here, it also has some of Demon Hunter's weakest songs ever, like The End. I mean, not a great song at all, but Outlive by Demon Hunter. Of course, like I said, not one of their best, but it is rather overhated. So next up, we got Release the Panic by Red. And I would say that this is definitely their most overhated album. Not one of their best albums by any means, not even close to one of their best, of course, but I think it's still a pretty good album for what it is. This album does hold a special place for me because this was the first album that I've ever pre-ordered. Obviously, that's when I used iTunes, and I pre-ordered it on iTunes, and it was the first album I've ever pre-ordered, technically. And I actually went to see Red during this tour. So that's another thing that kind of makes this album a little important for me. But yeah, it's a good album, but of course it's not one of their best. They did experiment more with this album with electronics and other stuff. But I do like the title track. I do like If We Only, So Far Away. But this album also has some of their weakest tracks, like Same Disease. I mean, this song, it's one of their worst songs without a doubt, but this album, not perfect, but I still think it's pretty good. So Release the Panic by Red. I think it's overhated, and it had to make the list. Next up, we got Presence by Led Zeppelin. Now, you can make a debate on whether or not this album is overhated, but the reason I have this album on the list is because, well, lately I've been seeing a lot of people, in their Led Zeppelin rankings and stuff, A lot of people say that this is their worst album, which I'm just like, no, this is not their worst album. I think this is a great album, actually. Of course, you got many great songs on it, like Achilles' Last Stand, which is easily one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs of all time. Definitely somewhere in the top 3, I'd say. You also got Nobody's Fault But Mine, which is also really good, as well as T for One. But Presence, I can understand where people are coming from when they say that this is, you know, not one of their best albums or not their best album, whatever. But I do like the album, and I think it's a good album. Well, I think it's a great album, actually. Saying good is a little strong, I'd say. But I think it's a great album. But yeah, and a very underrated Led Zeppelin album. I mean, definitely check out the album if you haven't already. And if you are one of those people that do say that this is the worst Led Zeppelin album, please give it another listen. I mean, it's a really great album, I think. So, Presence by Led Zeppelin. I figured it was worthy of being on a list like this, of course. But next up, we got Hold Your Fire by Rush. Of course, Rush is a great band, and weirdly enough, I've been seeing a lot of hate for this album as well. And I'm just absolutely mind blown by that. I don't know why. Now, their weakest album, in my opinion, is probably Vapor Trails, but even that's a good album still. So there is no such thing as a bad Rush album, but Hold Your Fire, I mean, I don't understand the hate for it. Sure, maybe it's not one of their best albums still, but I do like the album. It's a good album, and it's quite underrated. I mean, you got great songs on here like Force 10, Time Stands Still, of course. I mean, Time Stands Still's on the album. Like, what's the hate about the album, you know? Open Secrets, Prime Mover, and Mission. I mean, these are some solid tracks. What is the hate about this album? Why do people have this at the bottom of Rush rankings and things like that? But yeah, Hold Your Fire. It's a really good album. Once again, I can understand where people are coming from when they say it's not one of their best, but to say that it's their worst, that's really pushing it. It really is. I think it's still a good album. So, Hold Your Fire by Rush. I think it's good. I don't understand the hate for it, honestly. Next up, we got Falling Into Infinity by Dream Theater. I have seen some people say that this is Dream Theater's worst album. If it isn't this album, it's, The Astonishing or their debut album. But I have seen some hate with this album. There's a lot of people that say that this album is just boring and just not very good at all, and it's their weakest album. I would agree that this is their weakest in terms of their 90s material, but to say that it's their weakest album overall, no, absolutely not. This album, I think, is actually really good. Of course, you got many great songs on here, like New Millennium, which is a really good album opener. I also really like Burning My Soul, Lines in the Sand, Trial of Tears. I mean, these are some great songs. What's the hate about the album, But yeah, Dream Theater kind of went for a prog rock kind of influence with this album. It's not progressive metal like a lot of their other stuff is, but even though that's the case, I still think it's a really good album. It is different compared to the other stuff in the 90s time, but still a good album. So Dream Theater with their album Falling Into Infinity. Sure, it's not one of their best, but I think it's still a good album still, and gets a lot of crap, I think. So next up, we got Tribe by Queensryche. And I think this album is actually really underrated. I've seen some crap for this album as well. Now, of course, this is in Queensryche's 2000s time. Now, 2000s Queensryche is, well, needless to say, it's probably one of their weakest, if not their weakest era. But I would say their weakest era is probably the first half of the 2010s era of the band. In my opinion, this is really the only good 2000s Queensryche album, and it's also, I think it's the last good Queensryche album with Geoff Tate. I mean, but for what the album is, I think it's still really solid. It's still a good album. I mean, you got songs like Open, Losing Myself, Desert Dance, and The Art of Life, which is, I think, one of their most underrated songs. I mean, I don't understand the hate with this album either, because I do see some people, say that, this is one of their weakest albums. This is on the same weakness as Operation Mindcrime Part 2 and American Soldier, and, pretty much all their other 2000s work, which I don't agree with. Like I said, I think this is the only good 2000s Queensryche album. I think this album is still really good for what it is, and it's underrated. Sure, it's not Queensryche's best album. I don't think it's anywhere close to one of their best, of course, but it's still a good album for what it is, and I think it gets way more hate than I think it should. So Queensryche, with their album Tribe, I had to put it on the list. So, last but not least, the last album on this list that I think is really overhated from a band that I really like, and that is, of course, The X Factor by Iron Maiden. And this album, it's one of their most underrated albums, that's without a doubt. I mean, this is, of course, in the Blaze Bayley era of Iron Maiden, and this is definitely the better of the two albums with Blaze Bayley. There was this album and Virtual 11, which is their weakest album, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinions as well. But I've seen some people give crap to the X Factor. I've seen some people say that it's one of their weakest, along with Virtual 11, which I don't agree with at all. Sure, it's a different vocalist, but I still think this is a really great album, and it's underrated too. I like the dark mood that you get with this album, and the songwriting is actually pretty good. So I don't understand the hate with this album. I think this is one of their most underrated albums right here. And yeah, The X Factor, really great album. It's got a lot of great songs on it, like Sign of the Cross, Lord of the Flies, Man on the Edge, Judgment of Heaven, 2 AM, and The Unbeliever. I mean, these are some great songs, and some of these songs are actually really underrated. But yeah, Iron Maiden with their album The X Factor, it's overhated, but I don't understand the hate with it. Just because it's a different vocalist on it, I don't get that, man. But yeah, The X Factor, it's a good album. Well, there you go, guys. That is my list of albums that I think are really overhated by great bands. Feel free to let me know what you think of this list, and what are some albums you would put on this list as well. I'm curious about that, so let me know, and let me know what you guys think of my list. And just let me know your thoughts overall. So with that being said, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.